So hello dear students, I hope you are happy and healthy, and as always I hope you are ready to learn. Until now we've talked about all those activities that would help us create a good software, one that is worthy of being released, a software that is well tested, and also certain principles on how we can establish these things. How do you develop a good software? What are the essential practices that you can follow? For example, continuous integration to make development and testing more integrated. We learned about automating the tests. We learned about a few tools that we can use to automate the tests. We learned about a few tools that can help us manage our source code better, which was version control. We learned about different kinds of tests and how we could automate these tests. We learned about a few automated test suites as well. Not in detail, but yes, we did get a brief understanding of these things. But all of these activities that we've been doing so far, developing, testing, automating these tests, preparing reports, obviously requirement collection and analysis, all these things seem to be targeted so that your software can ultimately end up somewhere, so that it can end up in the market, right? So that you ultimately have a quality piece of software that you can give to your customers. And that process is as important as any other. The process of giving your completed software to your client is as important as any other. And that is where we are today. We've seen all of them. It's time for us to see this last part, and that is releasing your application. Today we talk about deploying and releasing a completed application. So here's a broad list of topics and concepts that we will be seeing today. I will start off with an introduction to releasing and also to deployment. We will try and understand the difference between deploying for testing and also deploying for releasing. After which we will move on to release strategies. For every new software that you release, you need a release strategy, which says how exactly you plan on carrying out releases of your software. And I said releases, not release, but releases. It includes the future upgrades also. So for every version of your software that you release, there will be a release plan too. Uh, and hence we will talk in detail about release strategy, about release plans. From there we move on to this concept of promoting a build through your deployment pipeline, where we will give some emphasis on the first deployment. We will do a small review of deployment pipeline modeling, and then finally we'll talk a lot about promoting your application. In the fourth section, we will talk about this concept of rolling back a deployment. How do you roll back a failed deployment? In case of a failure when you deploy it, how do you roll back a failed deployment? In this rollback, that we will learn a very important concept, which is a zero downtime release, and two techniques that we can use to achieve zero downtime release, that are blue-green deployment and canary releasing. In the last section, we will discuss about continuous deployment, which is a philosophy that can save a lot of money, save a lot of time, and also it helps you achieve a lot of good practices that can be lifesavers when it comes to developing good software. Without further ado, let's get on with the topic, and we will be starting our discussion with an introduction to deployment and release. Deployment is certainly not a term that we are unfamiliar with. It's a term that we have a good working understanding about. It's also a term that some of you may have already created an intuitive definition in your minds as well. However, to ensure that we're all on the same page as we proceed further, as we dig deeper into this concept, it is important that we have a formal definition for deployment. The definition can be split into two parts. We'll talk about the first part first and then about the second part. But before that, let me ask you one important question. Why do we create a software? Why do we create a software? Right? There are probably many reasons, but let's put them under two umbrella terms. I'll put them under two umbrella reasons. One is is because somebody asked you to create a software. Somebody asked you to create a software, right? For example, the government of India decides to do something. For example, take the MyGov app. You may be familiar with it. You may be familiar with the government of India's MyGov app, which probably was our honorable Prime Minister's idea. We don't know. And probably the PMO's idea and the different IAS officials involved in it. But it was certainly not my idea or your idea. It was the idea of somebody in the government of India, the executive of government of India, and not by any of us. However, we are the people who use it. The people of India use this application, right? And obviously, it was not government of India who created MyGov app. It was created by somebody else. Right? It was created by somebody else. It was created by a company. Right? It was created by a company for government of India so that people of India could use it. Is that clear? A software that is created for somebody, right? Created because somebody asked you to create it for somebody else, right? A software that is created because somebody asked you to create the software for somebody else, right? This person is the user, but this person asked you to create the software, right? The software is used not just by this somebody but also by other users. This could be one type of software. Another kind of software could be the software that you decide to create yourself. You decide that you want to create a software and you create it. And why did you create it? That's up to you. Maybe you created it so that you could sell it. Sometimes you created it out of love for programming, or you wanted your idea to come to life, right? This software you created for yourself. So let's just call it as a commercial software. We'll call it a commercial software which you created so that you could sell, right? You can sell it for money. Sometimes you can sell it for love. Sometimes you can sell it, you don't even have to sell it. You can keep it with yourself. But anyway, these are self-initiated. But generally, when we talk about software development in the industry, we talk about commercial products. These are commercial products. Companies don't make software so that their CEOs can take it home and let their children play with it. They create software so that they can sell it. So for a big company, there are only two kinds of projects. One that is initiated by somebody else, and the second one that is initiated by themselves so that they can sell it, right? This first kind of software is what you would call a software that you develop for a client, a software that you develop for a client, right? And the second one is obviously called a commercial software that you create for end users or software consumers. These software are created for software consumers, and the first one is created for clients. The client will pay you the money for the software you created. What happens to the software is up to the client. Whether he sells it, whether he uses it himself, it's all up to the client, right? And the commercial software, you create the software, you sell it, and you get your money for it directly. So now that we've talked about we've discussed why we create software, let's talk about deployment. Talk about the definition of deployment. Deployment, as you can see from the definition, it involves all activities. It includes all activities involved in delivering the software to the client. Right? Forget the second part. We'll talk about this later. We'll talk only about the first kind of software here, where we have a client. It involves all activities involved in delivering the software to the client, right? There are many activities. We'll talk about each of them in detail. However, the deployment includes all activities through which you take your completed software and get it to your client. And when I say get it to your client, it does not mean that you take your software, you write it into a pen drive, and then you pack it up in a gift wrap and send it through India Post or some courier service. That's not what we're talking about. That's not the kind of delivery that we're talking about. We're talking about a more technical, we'll be talking about more technical things here, right? But generally speaking, we'll try and understand this through an example. Assume that your software is a web application or a website, right? Your software is a web application. Deployment for a web application would mean that you are taking this web application and you are placing it in a web server. You're placing it in a web server and also probably a database server as well. You're placing it in a web server and database server. Database will place in a database server and the web code will be placed in the web server. And once you do that, you are making this available to the people for whom this software was designed for. Whoever it was. If it is for the general public, then it is being made available to the general public. Maybe it was for the client, then you are making it available to the client so that the client can do whatever he wants with it. I hope this is clear. Deploying a software means taking the software that you created and placing it in a machine for which the software was designed for, right? Placing it in a machine for which it was designed for, and then making it available to whoever it was designed for. Please understand that this machine and its configurations, this machine plus its configurations is what you would call a production environment, right? Is what you would call your production environment. The machine plus the configurations is what production means, right? Production is not the environment in which you produce your software, but the environment into which you will be deploying your software, right? We've discussed this even before, but I'm just reminding you what these terms are. We'll be using them quite a bit later on in this section. In this session. So please be initiated with these terms, right? The second part of the definition goes all activities involved in rolling the product out to the end user, right? This is for the second kind of software. This was for the first kind of software was for clients. The second part of the definition says deployment is not just for when you deploy it for a client, but it's also when you deploy your software for end users, right? End users or software consumers, rolling it out to for end users. For example, when Mark Zuckerberg and friends when they deployed Facebook, when they released Facebook, right? When they released Facebook, what were they doing? They released it for end users, of course. In Harvard, he released it for his college mates, but later on, when Facebook became a commercial product, he released it for end users like you and me, right? For commercial products like computer games, we saw web applications. Let's talk about games, right? These games and all, they are not often delivered through the internet. Yes, nowadays you get all these different options like Steam and all those things, but or PlayStation, I don't know, PlayStation Live, or I don't know, it's Xbox Live, I don't know what it's called. But anyway, you have all these online gaming services. But some time back, even today, you have games that are packaged in CDs or delivered through other services that are not really through the internet. So how do you deal with offline games or offline software that is delivered to the clients? You see, my earlier example may have given you an impression that all software, that deployment is applicable only to software that is delivered through the internet. You see, deployment is applicable to software that is given out in the form of CDs or given out in the form of pen drives, or the ones that you download from the internet, not just ones from which you directly deploy it onto a server, but ones that end users download and install themselves, or ones that they get in a pen drive or in a CD or a DVD or whatever it is, right? Those kind of software are also that process is also called deployment, where you install the software by yourself. That is also deployment. So how do we deal with those kind of issues? How do we get the software to the end user, and how does the end user use it? What are the different complications? And that is what we are going to study in the upcoming sessions. Okay. Now that we're all on the same page, at least as far as the definition of deployment is concerned, I guess it's time that we started discussing about deployment in a little more detail. In little more detail. From the last slide, you may have got an impression that deployment is done only when you release a software. And you're not wrong to make that assumption. But deployment is only the process of taking your software and placing it in production. It's only the process of taking your software and placing it in production so that you can use your software in production. Right? Why would you want to do that? Yes, of course, you would do that when you release your software. But you may also want to do that so that you can test your software in the real environment. How will this particular software work once it is released? How will it work in the real world? That might be a question that you would want to ask yourself, and you would want the answer to that as well. And so you will deploy your software into production even before it is released, right? And then perform a bunch of tests so that you are sure that your software will perform well in the real world. So deployment could be done for testing also, and not just for release, which is what we are going to discuss about in detail in this particular section. We will use the software release cycle and try and get a better understanding of what deployment to testing means. We'll first just review the software release cycle, and then we'll finally discuss deployment to testing, right? At each of these stages, I will tell you what each stage is. I will tell you why we need each of these stages. I'll tell you who is involved in each of these stages, and where these stages are performed. Where, in which computer, or in which which place will you perform these things. So 4 questions that we will answer for each of these stages. Number 1, the pre-alpha stage. So what is this stage, right? In this stage, we do all of the development. The software is developed, right? All of the software developed, all the modules in your software are developed in this stage, and each of these modules is unit tested. And once the modules are ready, some of the modules are ready, you start performing integration testing to see how these modules interact with each other. Are they doing the integration properly? And then finally we will perform system testing when the system is ready. We'll perform to see we'll do a few smoke tests. We'll perform extensive system testing to see how the system is performing as a whole. So these are the activities that happen in the pre-alpha stage. So that is what. So why do we do this? Obviously, why do we perform developing? So that we have code, we need a software, so we need to perform developing. Unit testing, obviously, to see if the units are working properly, then to see how the different units integrate with each other. Finally, system testing to see how the system behaves as a whole. Right. And who does each of these activities? This is done by the developer. This could be done, the rest of it could be done using test script, or it could be done by the testers and the developers together. They might create test scripts, right? So it is done by testers and testing and development team, no doubt, not anybody else. Where is it performed? It's performed on some system that you probably use for development, or maybe some system that you've kept for testing. It's certainly not a system that you have specifically designed to feel exactly like production. It may not be exactly as your production environment. It may be slightly different. It may have a lot of differences from production, but the goal here is to see only if the integration between units and the system is performing okay as a unit, right? As a whole. And so it is performed within the company. It will be performed using the infrastructure that the company has at its disposal by the company's own staff. Right. Right. So in the next stage, which is the alpha stage, what are the activities that happen there? In the alpha stage, we know that we already have the source code. The source code is ready. The binaries are ready. Some of the preliminary testing has also been done in the pre-alpha stage, right? In the alpha stage, something different is done here. Here, your software, it has gone through all the preliminary tests. Now you need approval from your clients whether your software is good enough. Has the software met their expectations? Has it satisfied their desires, you could say, right? Are they happy with the software? So the purpose of this particular stage is to see if the users are happy. Are the users happy? Are the users happy? Or in other words, we perform the user acceptance testing in this stage. Are the users accepting? Are the user acceptance criterion accepted? Okay here of the software. Have we met the users acceptance criterion uh, when we design the software? That is the question we'll be trying to answer. Are the users happy with the software? Have the users accepted the software? Right? Why are we doing this? Obviously, because it is the user who asked us to create it, or the client was the one who asked us to create it, and so we're going to ask his opinion. What does he think about the software? And obviously, you have to take his opinion very seriously. It cannot be because he's the one who will ultimately pay you money. If he's not happy with the software, he will not pay you the money. Right, so the alpha stage, once it is past the pre-alpha stage, it goes into the alpha stage. And in the alpha stage, it's simple. Here, since we performed all the preliminary tests, what is left is to see if the software is meeting the acceptance criterion set by the users. And for that, you perform user acceptance testing to see if the software has met the expectations of the client. Okay. And obviously, because it is the user's expectation that needs to be addressed, it is going to be performed by the users or the clients or some subject matter experts, people who know a lot about the software, sometimes even by developers in your own company who may not be who may not be directly involved in the project, right? Right. And why do we do this? Obviously, because the client has to be happy with the software. If the client is not happy with the software, we will not get the money. We will not get the dollars, right? And that's why you do this particular stage. And who does it? Yeah, obviously it's the client and the subject matter experts. And since it is the clients who are doing this testing, they would want to know how exactly the software will perform in real life. And so we will try and keep the testing environment as close to production as possible. We will try and keep the testing environment as close to production as possible, right? I'm not saying that it will be exactly the same as production, but we will try our best to keep it as close to production so that the client has confidence in the software, right? The next one, again, it is probably done inside the company and may not be outside, right? Sometimes maybe at the client's place as well. And once a software has passed the alpha stage, it moves on to the beta stage or the beta testing stage. Here, you could say that the client is happy with the software, right? If once you pass the alpha stage, it means the client is happy with the software. However, because you as a person and you as a company, you would want to meet the industry standards, the standards that are there in the industry, certain benchmarks that your software is expected to meet. For example, a web application should not crash just because 100 people logged into that web application at a time. Right? There are many non-functional aspects of a software like performance, speed, usability. Right? You may know these things. These are non-functional, not essential, not non-essential, but non-functional aspects. Right? Non-functional aspects. It doesn't have anything to do with the acceptance criterion, but it has to do with performance, speed, usability, robustness of the software. Right? These are things you ensure before you release a software so that you have a robust software that can stand the test of time. Even after 10 or 15 years, your software may be usable if you create a good software that is fast and highly user friendly, right? So these are industry standards that you would want obviously to meet. And so you perform certain tests to ensure performance, speed, usability, and then why do you do it? To ensure industry standards, to ensure that your system is robust against the test of time, and to probably even see some of the, and maybe you've not picked certain bugs in the previous test, you would want to catch those bugs as well, right? So those are a few reasons why you would want to perform this. And who performs this testing? It's obviously done by the clients or the end users, again sometimes by subject matter experts, right? And since it is performed by since it's performed by subject matter experts and end users and clients, it is going to be in production. It'll be either in production or it'll be in an environment that is as close to production as possible. Again, almost like alpha, but even closer to production, right? Sometimes it may be in production itself, but sometimes it may not be in production. However, it will be performed by clients or end users and subject matter experts. You may have heard of this website called Orkut, right? I don't know if you've used it. I don't know if you're old enough to remember this website, but Orkut was always in its beta stage. It never reached what we call gold. It was never out of the beta stage. It shut down even before it became a full-fledged product. Anyway, uh, to an ordinary person, it might seem that we've done enough testing, right? To an ordinary person, it might seem like we've done enough testing. As a matter of fact, not just to an ordinary person, to a person with uh, enough understanding of computers could also say that we have done enough testing. However, sometimes, just sometimes, you may want to perform one more round of testing, right? One more round of testing because you just want to be sure if things are going to be fine. You can never test your software enough. As they say, you can never test your software enough. But this particular stage, or the gamma stage, that the one that you reach after the beta stage, here this is an optional stage. Please bear that in mind. It is not always done. The gamma stage or the gamma testing stage is not always done. However, sometimes you will want to do it. It's simple. You deploy your software into production. You will deploy it into production, right? And then you will make it available not to everybody but to a few users, right? Only to a few users to see how exactly the software performs in production. I want to see how it will work in production. You're essentially deploying it into production so that a few people can use it, and then you can note the issues that come up. And in case any issues come up, you can fix it before you finally release it, right? This is just a precautionary stage, you could say. The people who use the software, they will use it as if they're using it normally. They're not using it for testing. You don't give them an impression that they are using it for testing. You're just telling them to use it as they would use it usually, right? And then you tell them, you collect their usage data and the bugs that they encounter. Probably you can have a bunch of scripts to automatically collect the usage data and usage scripts. Obviously, you'd have to get consent from these users even prior, right? You may be familiar with certain programs that certain cell phone manufacturers run, right? They will tell you that they will give you the latest updates, but these updates could be filled with bugs. There may be bugs, and they will ask you to send usage data. They will ask you to send usage data. So this is kind of a perk that you get. You get the latest software, but it could be full of bugs. And why is it so important to them? They are essentially releasing that particular update into production, which is your phone, and they are doing the debugging. It's probably the gamma stage. Could be the beta stage also. Sometimes it could be in the gamma stage. Um, anyway, going gamma is sometimes called as going silver as well, right? I'll tell you why it's called silver when we reach the next slide. So when you're in the gamma stage, it's also called going silver. Once your software has passed the um, gamma stage, it goes straight into, I mean, it's ready for marketing and packaging and releasing. Right? Nothing else is left. It's ready. It's completely ready, right? We'll discuss about that in the next slide. But however, there is one interesting thing that you may have noticed or may not have noticed. But as we move up, as we move ahead, obviously it is written that the market worthiness of the product increases. But one more thing you may have noticed, which is that the production or the testing environment that we use in each of these stages, right, is becoming more production like as we move ahead, right? It's becoming more production like. It's getting closer to production as we move up and move higher up. Right? For unit testing and all, you wouldn't. stress too much on a production like environment. It would be great if you could get a production like environment, but even if you don't get an exact replica of the production environment, you are happy with it. But as we move further up, we would want the testing environment to be as close to production as possible, right? As close to production as possible. As close to production as possible. Right. Please keep that point in your mind. Okay, now that we've discussed enough about deployment for testing, it's time for us to talk a little more about deployment for releasing and try to get a deeper insight into the differences between releasing and deploying for testing, right? So in the last section we said that once the software has gone gamma or once it has gone silver, the only thing that is left is making a few configuration changes, rerouting your repositories or your server locations, and then packaging up your software, performing some marketing on your software, and then releasing it, right? Putting it out to the cloud, to the end users to use it. This, once you've put your software out to end users, you can say that your software has gone gold, right? Your software is now in gold, which is also why you called it silver. The gamma was called silver. I know in real life you don't get gold by packaging and marketing silver, but in software engineering, if you take silver and you do something to it, you get gold. Right? This is not possible in real life, right? But anyway, this process is again very similar. This deployment is very similar to what you would do in testing. The procedure followed is quite similar, but we'll see the exact differences in the upcoming section. So what exactly is the difference between deploying to test a software and deployment for releasing a software? We have an illustration here where it basically shows how a software is being deployed, right? The upper portion shows how a deployment script can be used to deploy your software into a testing environment. And the second one, or the image that is shown at the bottom, shows how your deployment script can be used to deploy your software into production. It's written production, right? Let me correct that out. It's production, right? Anyway, you know the various components that are there that the continuous integration system and the various DevOps tools can utilize, right? Uh, the first one is the version control. What is the version control? The version control is basically just a repository that stores your configurations and your source code, right? It keeps track of your configurations and your source code across various versions. How do various versions across variations, how do configurations and source code change? That history is maintained by the version control. And then we have the artifact repository, which stores everything from reports. It stores the various assets that you have, right? It stores the various reports, metadata, and most importantly, it also stores the binaries or the executables that are needed for the software. This is very important. The artifact repository stores the binaries or the executables that you have for your software. The version control has the source code. The source code can be compiled or built, and then you finally end up with the binaries. The binaries, you keep them in the artifact repository, right? I hope this concept is clear. Right. The script, the deployment script, which we have here, the deployment script is basically just code that will take the binaries from the artifact repository. It will take the configurations from the version control, and then it will use both of these to configure the testing environment with the configuration that it receives from here, and then the binaries that it has received from the artifact repository. It installs the binaries and then it configures the system using the data it receives from these two, and then it is made ready for testing, right? The system is made ready for testing. Is that clear? The same thing happens when you release your software into production as well. It takes the configurations from the version control, it takes the binaries from the artifact repository, and then it places it in production. However, there is always a however. However, the configurations that you use for testing, right? C1. The configuration that you use for testing is not the same as the configuration that you use for, I'm sorry, I'm trying to use a different color here. I've made a big mess of that, haven't I? We'll use C1 and we'll use C2. The configurations that we use for production are different from the configurations that we use for testing. And why? Why do we use different configurations for production and for testing? The answer is very simple. Because when testing, our goal is to find out how good our system is or how well our system is performing, if there are any bugs or if there any issues are there. Right? So our configurations configure the test environment so that one, it is collecting some data, probably it is collecting some test data. Two, it may have certain test doubles. It may be configuring our system with certain test doubles also, right? You know what test doubles are, right? Test doubles are used in place of real objects that you would normally use in production environment, right? They are used instead of real objects. They're used instead of real objects or real methods or real classes or whatever. They are used in place of real programming elements, real programming entities, so that a testing becomes more convenient, right? Please, if you don't remember test doubles, please go back to the chapter on test doubles and have a good read about it. Anyway, we'll be discussing about test doubles in a bit more detail in the upcoming sections also. Okay, so configurations that are used for testing will include certain code that may be used for collecting some information about the test, and two, it may include configurations for test doubles. However, the configuration that is used when deploying your software into production will not include code to manipulate your test doubles or anything like that. Right? However, please bear in mind that the binaries that we used, or in other words, the actual executable that we use will be the same for testing. It will be pretty much the same, almost exactly the same for testing and also for when we release it into production, right? There will be minimum differences. There will be minimal difference between the executable here and here, right? We want to test this executable so that we know that this executable is working properly, right? Assume that you use one executable here which is working fine here, and then you create a second executable and then you release it. With how can you be sure that this executable is going to work here, right? So we'll use the same executables for testing and as well as while we deploy in production, right?